Today I'm going to talk about modulation, closely related keys, and pivot chords. To review, tonicization is taking a diatonic chord and treating it as a local key area within a globalized key. We're borrowing that local key's dominant structure, 5 or 7 of, and we're borrowing its leading tone in order to emphasize that diatonic chord. And we know that in a major or minor collection, stable sonorities are what can be tonicized. So no diminished sonorities can be tonicized because we don't have diminished keys. We have major keys, we have minor keys, and therefore we can borrow their dominant shapes. So these chords that can be tonicized are also what we refer to as closely related keys. So a closely related key is a diatonic structure which shares a lot of the same stuff as its origin. So if we're in C major, we can look at C major having a lot in common with a key area of D minor, or a key area of G major, or a key area of A minor. There's a lot of things in common between those scales, in other words, just taken diatonically. If we look at the minor collection, C minor has a lot in common with something like F minor. It also has a lot in common with something like G minor. And this is an interesting point where if we're talking about tonicization, we see motion toward major 5 pretty often, like a tonicized half cadence. We also see motion toward maybe minor 5, not as often, but often enough in terms of tonicization. In terms of closely related keys, minor 5 is the closely related key. We can see that much more clearly when we look at sort of like key signatures. But just think about the scales. A C minor scale has a lot more in common just in terms of pitch class content with a G minor scale than it does with something like a G major scale. There's a lot of difference that goes on. And I bring this point up a little bit later. I'm going to take C major and A minor as my point of origin. We know that C major and A minor have all the same content if we're not evoking leading tones in A minor. Diatonically, without alteration, one is a rotation of the other. So then, what a closely related key is essentially adding one sharp or one flat to the origin. So in other words, if we're in C major and we add one sharp, we get G major or E minor. And if we look at the pitch class content, most of the key is held intact. So in other words, all we need to do is have F sharp as opposed to F natural, and that's where the difference comes. So most of the stuff is maintained and invariant or unchanging. If we go the other direction, from C major / A minor to something like 1 flat, well, we can see that F major and C major have a lot in common. F major and A minor have a lot in common. So essentially, this context of adding one sharp or adding one flat is what gives us our closely related keys. As an example, take A flat major. We know that A flat major has a lot in common with F minor, everything. And we know that if we cancel a flat, which is the same as adding a sharp, we get E flat major and C minor. And they both have a heck of a lot in common with A flat major, except for maybe D flat missing. Then if we add a flat, we can see that D flat major and B flat minor, and those have a lot in common with A flat major as well. Notice that these are all chords that if we were in A flat major could be tonicized. We could tonicize 6, we could tonicize 5, we could tonicize 3, we could tonicize 4, we could tonicize 2. Switching to the sharp side of things, E major / C sharp minor. Well, if we add one sharp to that collection, we get B major and G sharp minor. If we subtract a sharp, canceling it, which is the same as adding a flat, A major and F sharp minor. And again, notice that these are all chords that can be tonicized in E major. If we were in C sharp minor, these are all chords that could be tonicized as well. The Roman numerals would change, but they can all be tonicized. So closely related keys, we're talking about essentially one sharp or one flat removed from the home key or origin. And we're also talking about things that could be tonicized. If they can be tonicized, they can be modulated to using a pivot chord. A pivot chord is a promiscuous chord. It exists at once diatonically in the previous key, and it also exists diatonically in the new key. So if we're finding a way to represent it, I use a bracket to show the previous key, whatever the Roman numeral is, and then to show in the new key what the Roman numeral is going to be. And it's commonly going to be a predominant function in the new key. That's what makes pivot chords most effective in terms of sound quality. And the quality is going to remain the same because the chord isn't changing. So if that pivot chord is a minor chord in the previous key, it's going to be a minor chord in the new key. If it's a major chord in the previous key, it's going to be a major chord in the new key. So don't make that mistake of mislabeling them in terms of quality of chord. So let's compare C major and A minor. We know that these are relative key areas. They share the same key signature. And we know that they virtually have the same genetic makeup when the leading tone is not evoked in A minor. So therefore, we have a lot of common ground here. So in terms of pivot chords, virtually any harmony could be thought of as a pivot chord between C major and A minor. Now some are more common than others. If we're thinking about a pivot chord as a predominant in the new key of A minor, well then maybe D minor makes a lot of sense because it functions as a 4 chord in A minor. F major might also be a likely choice. So some chords will be more likely than others, but in terms of going from C major to A minor or vice versa, a lot of things would function as a pivot chord. And essentially, if you're trying to sell A minor, once you get through that pivot chord, getting to a dominant sort of cadential paradigm is the sort of name of the game at that point. Further examples. Take C major, and let's figure out how we can get to something like F major. Now, if we're looking at Roman numeral content, we can see what functions in C major and how it functions in F major. Well, now let's look for common tone or common chord shapes. These are what can function as pivot chords going from C major to F major. Notice we have D minor in common, we have C major in common, we have F major in common, and we have A minor in common, all of which can function as pivots into F major if we're coming from C major. And some are more common than others. Maybe D minor would be a good choice. Maybe A minor would be a good choice because they can function as predominants in the new key. Now if we compare C major to D minor, just to kind of double track with all of our work, we can see that where I put those bubbles doesn't change because the chords are still going to be the same, but function is different. So we can see the same sorts of chords being appropriate to get from C major to D minor. Some of them are going to be more likely than others, so maybe that F major chord starts to become a little bit more appealing for this chordal shift. Notice that if we want to modulate from C major to D minor, we can't use a B flat major chord as the pivot anyways. There's other ways to do it chromatically, but in terms of diatonic space with a pivot harmony, it's not going to happen with B flat major because that's not part of a C major diatonic collection. So if we compare C major to something like G major, well, we can see other sorts of things that are common now. So in C major, we can see that we can use a 1 chord or a 3 chord, maybe a 5 chord or a 6 chord to get toward G major. We can't use chords that involve F sharp because those are going to be foreign to C major as a key area. And notice that F sharp would be some sort of dominant shape in G major. Predominants are going to function a little bit better. So that 4 chord in G major, that C major chord starts to look pretty appealing. Also that A minor chord is pretty appealing as well. If we think about comparing it to E minor, for instance, well, same exact type of thing, but different sort of Roman numeral content is what we'd be looking at in terms of what could be used as a pivot from C major to that E minor key area. Before moving on, just want to backtrack. If we're in A minor and we're modulating to the dominant, E minor is the closely related key of choice. E major is pretty foreign to A minor when you look at its accidental content. For instance, you have C sharp in E major. That's really different from A minor that has C natural. You also have other things that make E major different. But if we're talking about closely related keys anyways, we're talking about similarity of their scalar diatonic structures. If we're tonicizing 5, we can tonicize minor 5 or major 5 equally. It's just in terms of modulating and using a pivot chord, this is what we're talking about. It's kind of hard to find a diatonic pivot chord between A minor and E major. So if you're going to see that modulation happening, some sort of chromatic play is probably happening, which you'll study further down the road. As an example, say we're going to modulate from G major to E minor using a pivot chord. We know that G major and E minor are closely related. They're so closely related, we call them relative keys. And the pivot chord we're going to use is the people's chord, C major. So in the key of G major, a C major triad functions as a 4 chord, a predominant, a subdominant. In the key of E minor, a C major triad functions diatonically as a sixth chord, maybe a tonic substitute, a submedian chord in other words. So if we're trying to show this analytically, we can say G major, we have a 4 chord. And in E minor, which is a 6 relationship to G major, we have what looks like a 6 chord going on in E minor. It's a C major chord borrowed from E minor. That Roman numeral 6 below the E minor is just indicating the goal of where I'm coming from and going, G major to E minor. So we might think about 6 as being a predominant in the new key of E minor. It's a weak predominant, but it's a predominant nonetheless. As a musical example to play out what I just diagrammed, so D sharp comes into the picture in measure 2, which pulls us out of G major pretty hard. That points us toward E minor. And it actually accentuates the two cadences. The deceptive cadence that happens in measure 3, and then the authentic cadence that happens at the end. That PAC belongs to E minor, not G major. And how do we get there? Well, it's 6/4 chords that really tell us the story here. In measure 2, by the time we get to this cadential 6/4 chord, E minor is just initiated. That 6/4 shape tells us about that key of E minor, especially its metric placement here, and then followed by that 7/5/3 shape afterward. And the same goes for measure 3. That deceptive cadence in measure 3 would not work if E minor was not already established. So then how do we get there? Well, looking at measure 1, that's all G major stuff. And then even initiating in measure 2, we could see G major. Could still be G major. But instead, that F sharp diminished chord in measure 2, beat 2, functions as a predominant in the new key, which facilitates that motion toward the deceptive cadence. So you can mark actually 2 different spots for a pivot here. Measure 2, beat 1 is the spot that I marked. That 4 chord in the old key of G major functions as a 6 chord in the new key, which is the diagram that I showed. But one could look at the next beat and say, well, maybe that 7 diminished chord in the old key is the same as that 2 chord in the new key. Both of these spots make a lot of sense. Ultimately, with a pivot chord modulation to a closely related key, I'm just looking for a chord that functions in both keys diatonically at once and is represented faithfully with that sort of function within both keys. If we were singing these sorts of things, then it's just a matter of preference. Where does one pivot syllables? So if I was singing this bass voice, maybe I would choose something like measure 2, beat 2 as my spot to pivot, or in the melody, the same sort of thing. Which will create some sort of weirdness. I mean, if you think about the syllables here in G major, it's going to go do, ti, do, mi, fa, fa, sol. So repeating fa twice, but that ends up being the type of thing that ends up going on here. Or if we're doing it in the melody, sol, fa, mi, sol, la, re, do, ti, do. These things should kind of not jive with the way that our mind wants them to go, which makes sense. This is what we end up with when we're pivoting and modulating in terms of singing land anyways. So choose your spot. I mean, you could have also chose the beat before that, measure 2, beat 1, as the spot to change it, in which case the bass voice might go, instead of mi, fa, might go from mi, le, fa, sol, sol, le. That totally makes a lot of sense too. Just depends on what your choice is, what your preference is. So there's some flexibility there, but ultimately you're showing the same thing. You're just choosing to do it at a different area than somebody else might. More than one way to do it. So modulation, closely related keys, and pivot chords. So modulation is a change of tonic, a new do. So that actually brings me to an important point. If you're in something like C major and the music moves to C minor, That's not necessarily a modulation by definition because tonic is staying the same. That's just a modal shift that's going on. So a change of tonic, a new do, which means you have to change syllables if you're singing these things out. Closely related keys we're talking about a key that's one sharp or flat removed from the origin. So in other words, anything that can be tonicized can be modulated to via a pivot chord. So what's a pivot chord then? Well, a pivot chord is a chord that exists diatonically between both keys in the process of a key change. And if we're talking about a pivot chord, predominant function in the new key is what ends up being most commonly seen anyways.